particularly electromagnetic pulse and cyber warfare. We met on Joint Base San Antonio at the Air Force Base. We were invited by Lieutenant General Stephen Quast. He brought in experts from across the country and in San Antonio to discuss how they could protect the 5 military bases located in San Antonio and make it a model for the rest of the United States to defend our nation against economic warfare. Join me in the Economic War Room, where we'll talk with General Quast and also former CIA Director Jim Woolsey and really Major Stuckenberg, who's recently written an important report on protecting our nation. Welcome to the Economic War Room. Well, it's an incredible honor to have been invited in by the commander of the Air Education Training Command, Lieutenant General Stephen Quast. And we're in his offices now, and we have the pleasure of having Major Stuckenberg and Ambassador Woolsey, two of the authors of the Electromagnetic Defense Task Force report. And they cover some material that we've talked about in the War Room before, and it's absolutely essential that we understand what they're saying. This is, what did you say, Major Stuckenberg? This is the most downloaded report?
For published electronic journals and materials at Air University. It has broken every record for readership and is over 26,000 readers right now.
Wow, it's a pretty scary report about the vulnerabilities that we have. Off camera, Ambassador, we were talking about what our adversaries know about vulnerabilities. Could you just describe some of the findings of the report?
Well, this is not a new issue. The sun has been bombarding the Earth with magnetized radio waves for about 4.1 billion years. And it still does occasionally, and even once in a while, one of them will come close enough to a major electric grid that it'll knock things out for several days. But what really caused the dawn of, I would say, adversarial use of electromagnetic pulse was some atmospheric nuclear tests that were undertaken in 1962, just before the atmospheric test ban treaty came into effect, while the Americans and Russians could still test other than below ground. And both we and the Russians found out in the tests in that year that we could knock out electronics thousands, or at least 1,000 miles away, line of sight, with these electromagnetic pulses generated by the gamma rays from a nuclear detonation. By the way, it doesn't have to be a big nuclear detonation. It's all about gamma rays, not about blast. It can be a tiny bit of blast.
So what we're talking about essentially is that the modern electronics that we use are vulnerable to, it could be a solar flare that hits, and we've seen that happen, or it could be a planned and perpetrated attack using a small nuclear weapon in space. This is what we talk about as an electromagnetic pulse, or an EMP.
Yes.
Okay.
Russian General Slipchenko died 3 or 4 years ago, but one of his quotes, he was a major Russian strategist, one of his quotes is that the next war will be a no-contact war. And what he meant by that was no particularly important contacts between human beings and bullets or shrapnel, but lots of contact between different electronic parts of the electronic spectrum. And we could see huge shares of our electric grid go down even with a small nuclear detonation launched, say, from a container ship. It doesn't have to be a big sophisticated missile or anything like that at all.
Wow.
And generally one of the issues with the overall power grid, and to Jim's point about the ability to detonate potentially one instrument, what that does is it has a catalytic effect. So if one grid's power fails, because of all the U.S. grids, there's more than 3,000 of them are connected. The other grids try to pick up the load and the way in which that load is distributed is most generally assumed to cause failure across the whole network.
So it cascades. It's a domino.
Cascade.
Not only does the electricity disruption cascade, but pretty much our entire electric grid, as well as our water systems and our financial systems and so forth, now are rooted in the web in one way or another.
Sure.
And what that means is that once that starts to fail or collapse, the rest of the system does too. Everybody seems very happy about moving toward a web that is an Internet of Things. So your car's GPS talks to your coffee maker at home and automatically starts up your coffee so it's ready when you get in. Isn't that great? But if all of these things are interneted with one another and you disrupt one in a particular way, you may find that you have created a cascading failure. And I mean, for example, you can't just go pump gasoline at the local station if your car needs gasoline, because the pump is electric.
And that's one of the things that the task force report highlights, is that we need to take a more in-depth look at the key dependencies. If we are depending on an assured capability to do whatever, is that capability really assured unless we've taken a look at every element of what that depends on?
Well, let's back up a second, because this is scary stuff. And you come from an intelligence community background. You represent the brilliance of the military looking at these problems. What you're saying is that adversaries, or even the sun, has the potential to take away all of these wonderful benefits that we're living under from the electromagnetic spectrum. And that's what I loved about General Cross. When I heard him, he said, hey, this is a brilliant, beautiful world with the Internet of Things and all these other things, but every time we have innovation, we create new vulnerabilities that we need to address. And I think that's only logical. What are we doing from a military standpoint and an intelligence community standpoint? Is this a new recognition? Is this something that we're actively advancing, or is it something we really have some work to do?
Just getting started. The Major has had a lot to do with getting this going. General Quast has been basically the leader in the military.
Well, that's fantastic that you're addressing it.
We have a lot of ground to make up. That's the way I would put it. I think it's safe to say that after the first Gulf War, that some of our strategic competitors, who after we took a long hiatus from concerning ourselves with strategic elements and began to focus more on regional elements, things like Kosovo, building out the NATO alliance, they used that strategic pause to build capability, to build knowledge, not only to assess us, but to begin to look at the way we do our business. And certainly one could say that they have examined our lessons learned and understand what the extent of our dependence is across domain: air, land, sea, cyberspace, and space. We depend in all those domains on the electromagnetic spectrum.
All right.
It's this dependence that creates the problem. I was an advisor to the Congressional Commission that reported out a couple of years ago on EMP, and chaired by Dr. Bill Graham, who was President Reagan's science advisor. And that commission said that the pessimistic estimate of the number of Americans who would die in the first year after an electromagnetic pulse attack as a result of not only the food not being there, the water not being there, the financial exchanges not being there, because the electricity wasn't there. The result of all that would be something like 90% of Americans dead. That's like 300 million people. That's the pessimistic estimate. The optimistic estimate is that it's only about 2/3 of the American population. That's about 200 million people. This is as serious and major a threat and problem as we have ever faced as a nation. And it's a very good thing that some folks in the military and a few in civilian life, but particularly I think some in the Air Force have begun to take steps to try to deal with the problem because this is something people would just as soon have go away and not have to think about.
Well, they don't want to think about it, and not only that, but people assume when the power goes out, it's a matter of hours before it comes back. What they don't realize, and I think what I've understood from your report and the other things we've looked at, is they don't realize that you take the transformers down, and it might take a year or more to replace. How many transformers do we have, for example, large-scale transformers?
At very large scale, what do you think, 10, 15,000?
There are different estimates. I think the most important thing is that they are mostly, I think the number I have is 80% of those are created offshore, and there's a long lead time.
Up to a year, is what I've heard.
Yeah, largely,
one of the challenges would be that if there were either a geomagnetic event from the solar or one that is man-made potentially that were to impact the grid, you're looking at quite a long restoration period.
It's not something you call the local utility and say, hey, the power's out, and they send a small crew to do. It would be devastating because it would cascade, and once it did, you'd need to replace 10,000 transformers that take a year or more to get.
Right, I mean, a year would be fast, and they're made largely, I think, in South Korea and Germany, and you have to stand in line, basically.
Yeah, it would be catastrophic. There's no question about that. And so one of the things that's exciting, when we are in the economic war room, we like to give the bad. That's the problem. And we talk about the good. What can we do about it? And one of the things where I first met you, Major, was at Cyber Initiative in Cyber San Antonio. Can you tell us a little about that?
I'd be happy to, and I think it's a true silver lining, a wonderful success story of what can happen when a community begins to learn and act together to take responsibility for what they can do. The Joint Base San Antonio military complex is one of the largest physical military complexes in the United States. There's different estimates, but there's more than a dozen installations, military-owned properties in this city. It's also one of the largest metropolitan areas in the country. So you have a very interesting dynamic and interplay between those two. And what you also have is an apparent lineup of folks from industry all the way to the top of the city government who have begun to say, this is something we should do something about. And thanks to that knowledge level, they themselves initiated a Cyber Secure San Antonio initiative some months back. And thanks to the leadership of General Quast and others who are in command of the installations, Brigadier General Laura Linderman, they have said, let's do what makes sense. Let's tie these initiatives together, because not only are we interested in your resilience, we're interested in the DoD installations resilience, and in large part, these two are codependent. So if we protect one, we protect the other.
Well, and in fact, most of the military bases that we have are dependent on the civilian power grid. It's a rare exception when the military has their own power.
Almost all are. And even where there's a facility, upstate New York, for example, where the military facility will draw maybe over half the power from a grid, it's still the military and civilian integrated. So a lot of people think the military has its own power supply. So, no.
It's a rare exception. Now,
In
Cheyenne
some cases,
Cheyenne Mountain, they blocked it off and EMP protected it and so forth, but it's a very rare thing.
Exactly.
So there's a number of initiatives, to be forthright, going on around the country. I think it's safe to say that we need to beef those up, strengthen those, and add momentum. And we need to do so quickly, because I think, to my point earlier, our adversaries have been looking at opportunities for a long, long time. And I think the best analogy for where we are at as a country is similar to the Maginot Line.
Absolutely. The French had fought the Germans at least to a standstill in World War I by building bigger and bigger and better trenches. And after World War I, they figured that what could go wrong, we'll just keep building bigger and bigger and better trenches. And the Maginot Line evolved, and then the large version of the Maginot Line, and then Maginot Line with turrets, and on and on. and they thought things were going really well. In the meantime, over there on the other side of the Rhine, Guderian and some other German generals were coming up with a very clever idea, which was to put radios on tanks, and instead of fighting in formation, if several tanks burst through the French lines, then they would spread and attack the French from the rear.
Oh, yeah.
And they would be able to come through the break that they had established, and the French weren't ready to be attacked from the rear, and Paris fell in 2 weeks.
There's some other interesting lessons learned when looking at the condition of France before World War II and just in the early months. And there's some interesting parallels. One is that it took France a while to bring capability to bear. In other words, they realized there was a threat. I think it's safe to say that we've identified challenges and that we are beginning to address those. But what's interesting is what France did is they were addressing the threats of the past war. That was from World War I. They designed the Maginot Line around the 1920s and built it around the 1930s. So while that happened, there was a propaganda campaign as well. It's very interesting that France, basically, their message was, we're impenetrable, invulnerable. This wall will save us. And, there's a lot of historians who they began to believe that narrative. And because of that, even though they were aware of some of the new technologies coming online, they were aware of some of the new doctrines out there, like Blitzkrieg. Because of that wall, they felt safe. They didn't feel the need to adapt, to bring newer military technologies and habits to bear. And so what you ended up with was, essentially this massive effort that forced the enemy to the weakest point. And that was in the Ardennes and in the area on the northern end of the wall.
What's interesting, too, is in the book Unrestricted Warfare, and we talk about it a lot, there's a quote in there, the Americans are slaves to traditional technology in their thinking. They will never get this.
I would put it this way. The most accidentally dangerous phenomena ever to manifest itself in the history of warfare is the primacy of learning. The way we first learn it, the way you first learned to tie your shoes, I bet you did it the same way this morning.
Probably.
It becomes part of our DNA, part of our intrinsic thinking. And what we have to do is change our thinking as a military force and be able to work cross-service and understand that when we face a determined enemy, they're going to come at us in new ways and in illegal ways, often discounting the Westphalian Order. And that's going to be a challenge for us.
And the system not only blocks, but retaliates against the forward thinkers who say, look at what those Germans are doing, the Blitzkrieg, we better figure out how to deal with that. We shouldn't. That can be deadly to a career. A good friend of mine, when he was in junior high school and high school, dated Patton's granddaughter and knew the family and heard a lot of the family stories. And one of them was a very vivid description of how much trouble these two friends, Eisenhower and Patton, as young officers, got into for proposing innovation. They were threatened with courts-martial. They were really, dealt with almost very severely, escaped kind of by the skin of their teeth. And they went on, to put it mildly, to very distinguished military careers. But it's hard for someone with the vision of an Eisenhower or a Patton to get listened to in any bureaucracy. And sometimes our friends in the military embody that kind of rigidity.
Well, in fact, when I first took the idea of economic warfare into the Pentagon, it's about when I met you and we went to the district attorney in New York and so forth. I went into the Office of Net Assessment, and Andy Marshall was there. And one of the phrases that was used, I don't think he said it, but one of the people on his team, he said, you're warning us about economic warfare. You're kind of like General Billy Mitchell.
Yeah, right.
And
yeah.
General Mitchell, of course, he warned us that the Navy can't protect everything all the time, that there will be an Air Force, that Pearl Harbor will be attacked, and what did he get for that? He got court-martialed. And I think it was General MacArthur who said the most despicable thing he ever did was sit on the court-martial hearing of General Mitchell. because looking back, and he was right, and he was punished for being right.
One of the things we've often heard as we've gone through iterations with the Electromagnetic Defense Task Force is, it's about time. And that's one of the things I think General Quast has been admired for, is that, he was willing to discover, along with a multitude of subject matter experts, the need to reinvigorate education, not only across the force, and that's one of AETC's primary missions, is to educate the entire United States Air Force, both on doctrine, theory, and just how to do your day-to-day job. But he also understands the interconnect between the education piece and the wider DoD mission. And if we can't start with the baseline knowledge, then we don't have anything with which to drive, that strategy development at the higher level.
Well, I'm very appreciative to the two of you for bringing this to the attention of the American people, plus the attention of the intelligence community and the military establishment. But one of the things we try and talk about the bad, and we know what the bad is. The bad is 90% of Americans die because the grid goes down for a year or more. The good is that we're starting to address it here in San Antonio and other places. Let's talk about the beautiful for a second. If we're able to develop technologies to help protect our grid and so forth, won't that bring benefit? And, like the space program has brought enormous benefit for entrepreneurs, investments.
Huge. And the president and a number of the leading Democrats have talked about how important infrastructure is, and how investments in our infrastructure bear good returns, that they're necessary, that we need to get going. Well, if we pass up the opportunity while modernizing our infrastructure, at the same time to make it resilient against EMP and other electromagnetic threats, solar events, whatever, if we pass up that opportunity, and shame on us, but we've got a chance here to, in a sense, kill two birds with one stone. Fix the ordinary day-to-day weaknesses and bridges and the rest that we need to do for the infrastructure, but also to fix or at least build substantial resilience into the grid. If you have, let me give you one example. If you have a natural gas-powered grid and about 60% of the power is natural gas, but you're in a sunny area and things work right, and on an average day about 40% of your power is going to come from solar. That's not far off for the kind of analogy. If you're in that situation and the grid goes down and you've designed your portions of the grid in such a way that they can island into distributed generation, small distributed generation centers powered by solar, having the difference between having 40% of the electricity that you need and having none is the difference between an extraordinarily difficult situation and the end of civilization.
Could be life and death, yeah.
And so if you can design the grid and modify it in a way that parts of it can keep going, to start up the other parts, to keep the hospital emergency room going, even if you can't keep the long-term care part, et cetera, et cetera. If you can keep something going that you need, and even if it's only 30-40% of your electricity, you're still around and you're still fighting if you can hold on to that.
And not only that, if our adversaries understand that we have that capability, they may be a lot less interested in attacking the grid. But I come from a family of electrical engineers. I've got electrical engineers, and they all tell me if we can solve this problem, the learning that we have from solving this problem will bring all sorts of other additional benefits to humanity. We will advance things because our systems really are much more vulnerable than they should be. And if we learn resilience and we apply it across the board, we'll all benefit from it.
Another thing we have to do, I think, is take this extraordinary stable of brilliant computer people and software people and programmers in Silicon Valley and all the rest that we have in the United States. Some of them kind of renegades and get together in the desert every summer and do all sorts of crazy things.
We had one on a hacker named Jekyll on our program just recently.
Well, if we pull those people together with the best that the National Security Agency can come up with, and do what Roosevelt did in early December after Pearl Harbor of '41 and said, all right, all of you captains of industry, we're going to win this war, and you're going to do what I say, and here we go. Yeah. If we could stop always playing defense, we have maybe the best hockey team in the world, but everybody's playing goalie. No, we've got to be able to go on the offense too.
And that starts with letting everyone know, hey, we're on the offense. And I think that's one of the positives with the EDTF effort, is we've seen more than 40 DoD and government organizations participate. Even NATO sent their best EMS expert to attend, and we're getting ready to go into the second iteration that Air University will be hosting here later in the year. And we hope that it'll be bigger than the first time as we continue to break down the barriers between the organizations, as we get the professionals to talk to each other in a non-attributional educational environment, so that we can have those phone calls like I recently received from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that, hey, this is very interesting. We would like to learn more. Can you assemble some expertise to come and educate us?
That's great. Roosevelt, one of the things he did was he built a Bureau of Economic Warfare, which
Right.
a lot of people don't realize. And what we do in the Economic War Room is we try and take the national security issues and put it with not just national economics, but personal economics, so that there's opportunities for individuals. This isn't something that we do at a distance. Individuals need to be active. They need to be concerned and resilient grid. And I'll be moving my business to San Antonio, others will say, if you have a secure grid there.
I just the other day had a very wealthy foreign individual seek me out as a consultant, because what he wants to do is move his money from his country into infrastructure investments in the United States, because he figured they're conservative and the United States is going to be around longer than most anybody else. But rather than putting it in a gold in the American vaults or something like that, he's putting it in infrastructure.
And that's one of the express interests, I think, of the greater San Antonio area, is to provide a new economic opportunity, a new economic soil for businesses that they've never seen anywhere else. And that is that you can come here, you can be cyber resilient, you can be resilient in power, and let your company depend on us to provide you a new kind of environment that is secure.
Opportunity to take America to the next level as a nation and be a shining city on a hill, as President Reagan said. One last thing I want to wrap up with, but I believe, I've read your reports, I've studied this, I believe that this is a very real risk. And you see on a movie where they put a little mini EMP device in a casino, I think it was Ocean's 11 or something, they put that. We also have the historical evidence from the Carrington event that happened, and we have Lloyd's of London that's looked at this, and then we have the Russians, don't we, that took down the power grid in Ukraine before they did the invasion. This isn't science fiction. This is unfortunately very real, right?
As a tactic, technique, and procedure, a TTP, we've seen this become more prevalent in military literature around the world, whether it's Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. They know where there's vulnerability, and they're continuing to look at it. And I think it's time for us to close the door on that. In totality, to make our adversaries understand there is no doubt.
No point in trying to attack us.
And
Yes.
they're not only looking at it to do it in the future, they're doing it every day to improve their skills, and then of course they lie about it and say, us? We do something like that? Oh, no. It's lie through their teeth. The Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, a lot of people. And we've got to put ourselves in a position where we can be resilient against that and make that very unpleasant for them. Very, very unpleasant.
So, well, I really appreciate you taking time. It's important work that you're doing. It's something that we've studied for a long time, and it's so wonderful to see leaders such as yourself taking charge on the issue. You've become experts, and it's incredible what you're doing for our country. Thank you.
America deserves it.
Good to
Thank
be with you.
When we were in San Antonio, General Quast wasn't there. He was out of state on assignment. So I've invited him into the Economic War Room to share his thoughts on this important project. General Quast, thank you for taking time from your schedule to join us in the Economic War Room. You're the commander of the Air Education Training Command at Joint Base San Antonio, and you play a vital role in developing the best people for our Air Force. Thank you for that.
Well, I want to thank you for asking these questions and having the conversation with our country, because we are living in extraordinary times right now with the resurgence of China and Russia as great power competitions. So it's time to ask these kind of questions and really think deeply about who we are, how we think about our national security.
General, you've seen some amazing changes in your career. What are the new challenges that you see on the horizon for our national security in the 21st century?
Well, I would have to say that real national security starts in the minds of our thinkers and in our warriors. And so this is why I'm so grateful to be here at Air Education and Training Command, because we are laying the foundation for how you learn, not what you learn, but how you learn, and how you think holistically about this world and the complexity of how our societies are interconnected. So for me, starting with the basics, how do you think about national security? How do you think about technology? And how do you think about strategy? And how do you design the tools for our nation to defend itself against any potential threat with the tools and the strategies that are before us today?
What innovative things are you doing to recruit, train, and educate modern airmen?
Well, what we're doing is we're trying to take the business of recruiting, training, and education into the 21st century. So I'll give you a perfect example. In the recruiting business, building the kind of technology where a youngster in America who gets excited about the Air Force and the potential of making themselves into a hero by joining the Air Force and defending their country, that we make it easy for them to join the Air Force using apps and the technology that they use, social media. And likewise, we have tools to be able to measure their talent. You know, is this youngster in America going to be a good pilot? Is this one that wants to be an intelligence officer going to be a good intelligence officer? We know how to measure these habits of mind that would make somebody good at a certain career field. And we're just making this marriage in heaven, kind of like speed dating and these apps that get people together. We are mechanizing the ability to introduce future heroes of our country to the Air Force in a way that lets us see more people and take advantage of a broader pool of talent.
It was a real honor to join you at the interesting conference that you pulled together in San Antonio recently. You're focused on resilience in a broad sense. Tell us about the electromagnetic spectrum, why it's important to our future, and what risks it carries that we must address.
Yeah, that's a great question. And when people talk about the electromagnetic spectrum, that is nothing new. The electromagnetic spectrum is a field around us that has been there since the beginning of mankind. It's just that we're understanding how it works more and more fully every day. I'll give you a perfect example. Quantum physics is something new that we're discovering, how the particles of an atom really work. And it's really a transition from Newtonian physics, where Einstein knew he didn't have it quite right with E is equal to mc squared, but he wasn't quite sure what was missing. Quantum physics is starting to answer that question. Anytime you have new discovery about the world around us, there are those that will try to weaponize it. So the electromagnetic spectrum, put simply, is the field around us that scientists and engineers are discovering more and more every day how it can be either a tool for peace or a weapon of war, and we need to defend against that. The perfect example are the electrons that flow across every circuit board in our country. We as Americans are very dependent on that. Our water systems provide water to our homes using circuitry. Our financial systems, our transportation systems, our cars, everything is reliant on circuit boards and electricity flowing through them in most of the things we provide for society. In the electromagnetic age we live in, somebody could weaponize the electromagnetic spectrum to be able to stop the flow of those electrons in ways that could really bring potential risk to civil society.
Please, tell us about the vision you have for a cyber-secure San Antonio and how that can impact the rest of the country.
Well, cybersecurity San Antonio is nothing more than taking the vision that the city has already started articulating and building upon it. And essentially it's this, that you do not have to be vulnerable to the fact that you use electricity to do things. There are ways for us to design this wonderful blessing called data and the internet and everything electronic